Okay, so good morning, everyone. Som Kal for everyone. I want to I don't know if apologize is the right word, but I guess notify this, as you all know, this year was not an originally scheduled year. The request to give it at short notice, and also many of you, I don't know if many of you have heard. I think most of you may have heard. Yeshivat Eretz Tzvi is moving campuses, so we're moving Bezrat Hashem to the campus of Machon Lev for Elul, and we're actually going to be starting there in next week already with the students that we have for in our summer program. So it's been a very, very hectic time, good time, and with a lot of expectations and promise in the air. But not only COVID in the air, but promise in the air as well. So we are, but it's been very, very busy, good busy. So I'm going to be giving a shir that we visited a few years back, a topic that we spoke about in terms of Parshat Pinchas, on the question of the history of vigilantism in halacha. So it's it was a popular shir then, and hopefully it'll be on the rebroadcast, as it were. People will enjoy it. So here's the, let me put up the makarot. And, okay, and make it a little bit larger for everyone. Everyone see it? Okay. I'm assuming that if you couldn't see it, you tell me. So so this is what I'd like to discuss. Basically, when we look at Pinchas and the story, and we'll go through the story quickly just to bring everyone up to speed on it. When you look at the story, so the question that needs to be asked is, well, is this something which we should be, besides understanding the story in of itself, is this something which should be a paradigm for future generations? How would you apply it? Is it something which is totally in the hands of the individual, as vigilantism is generally going to be almost by definition? Is it something that the system is curbs, it tries to put limitations on of some kind? So these are the type of issues that we need to be looking at. So the Torah tells us that gives us a bit of a background. We had, this is the end of last week's parsha, that after all the entire story with of Balak and Bilam, etc. So the Torah tells us, Vayeshev Yisrael b'shitim, Vayechal ha'am liznot et be'el benot Moab. So the Yisrael at that point settled in this area of Shittim, and immediately the people began to engage in sexual activity with the daughters of Moab. So they called the people to sacrifice to their gods, and indeed the people ate and bowed to their gods. And Bnei Yisrael cleaved to Baal Peor. Apparently that was the name of the deity that was being worshipped. And God became angry with Yisrael. Now, this combination, and we'll come back to this a little bit, that there seems to be a combination of two components. The idea that you have both the sexual element as well as the pagan worship. Most likely, though it's not totally explicit in the psukim. Most likely you're dealing with a scenario where the two were intertwined in terms of the pagan rite in of itself, quite possibly involved sexual activity. So this is what's occurring. The Torah tells us that God himself is angry. Vayichar af Hashem b'Yisrael. Vayomer Hashem pasuk Daled. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe kach et kol rashei ha'am v'hoka'otam l'Hashem neged hashamesh v'yashov charon af Hashem miYisrael. So here God doesn't strike out. At least it's not explicit that there is some kind of we'll call it expression of God's anger beyond God telling Moshe to take the leaders, Kachet Rashei Ha'am, V'hokatam Lashem, and basically Neged HaShamesh, appoint them to God before in front of the sun, meaning out in the open. V'yashov Charon af Hashem Yisrael. The idea here is that God's anger is going to subside, and the way to deal with that, at least the way that Hashem is speaking to Moshe, is to use the system. In other words, Kachet Rashei Kol Ha'am. This is it's not an expression of vigilantism in any way. It's a question of dealing with a crisis in a measured and in a responsible manner with the leaders at the helm. Vayomer Moshe el Shoftei Yisrael, and who are the Rashei Ha'am? The Shoftei Yisrael. So they are people who are going to have due process in terms of dealing with this. Pirgu ish anashav hanitzmadim leval peor. You have to take action, you the Shoftim, and so you're going to go and execute the people who are guilty of the crime. V'hinei ish mibnei Yisrael ba. And now pasuk vav is where things go askew, because hinei ish Yisrael ba vayikrev alacha ve'el tamidyanit leinei Moshe uleinei kol adat bnei Yisrael v'hema bochim petach oel moed. So we have this perpetrator who is not named at this point, who will only be named in next week's meeting or this week's Parshat Pinchas, Zimri ben Salu. But at this point, we don't know who he is. He's a person who takes the Midyanit, and it's brazen. It's Le'enei Moshe u'le'enei kol adat b'nei Yisrael. Basically, it's flouting the system. It's saying, here you've set up the Shoftim. I don't care about your Shoftim. They don't, there's a total breakdown in the system, and that's reflected by the Hema Bochim Petach Oel Moed. So those same Rashei Ha'am, the same Shoftei Yisrael, Moshe himself, are crying, meaning that they are in effect powerless at the entryway to the Oel Moed. And this is the background for Pinchas. Vayar Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron HaKohen, vayakom mitach ha'eda, vayikach romach biyado. So here we now have the switch. Instead of it being the Shoftei Yisrael, we have it's Vayar Pinchas is now, he's the one who takes the lead, and he now takes his spear. Vayavo achar ish Yisrael al akuba, vayidkor et shnehem et ish Yisrael v'et ha'ish el kovata, v'te'atzer ha'magefa me'al b'nei Yisrael. And so he takes the action. He goes. There's the play on the word of kuba here, meaning the cubicle, but he spears, he skewers the two people, Ha'isha el kovata, to her stomach, Vateyatzer ha'magefa. And so the plague stops. Now remember, we hadn't been told about a plague, but here this is an expression that of Charon Af Hashem. As if this is the what we said earlier, that God Vayichar Af Hashem b'Yisrael, V'yashov Charon Af Hashem b'Yisrael, and the way that it's supposed to be dealt with seems to be through due process, but something's happening while the process is occurring. And there's this magefa, there is this plague which is befalling the people. So we have the 24,000 who have fallen, and this is the beginning of our pasha. So God is explicit that Heshiv et Chamati. This is again the same words that we saw before. Before it was Vayashov Charon Af. Here it's Chema, but it's the same idea, the same Heshiv. He was the one who took the this matter into his hands, and he was the one who was able to stop God's anger. And through Bikano et Kinati Bitocha, he was in fact, he's the Kanai, he's the zealot, but the zealotry was the same zealotry as in terms of that God himself was expressing. And what's curious here is that we get the idea of Hineni noten lo et briti shalom. So the response is that he now is given a covenant of peace. The shalom and the kina, the zealotry, which are of course polar opposites in terms of what they are meant to express. So that is the reward. So if you're looking at it just from that quick overview of the story that we just went through, so the impression that you're getting is that it's that there was an attempt to have a full judicial process. That attempt failed. And as a result, the Pinchas has to take the action in his own hands, and that's what changes everything. Now, given the impression, of course, not only does it change everything, but it also now gets its expression that he becomes part of the system by getting the Brit Shalom and the Kahuna for future generations. The Shalom, of course, could be, and this we're not going to see this inside, but there's an expression of this in various midrashim that because this was extrajudicial, so you could get the impression that perhaps there's no indication that necessarily the Pinchas did the right thing. So God himself has to get involved to make sure that Pinchas isn't punished unjustly for his action. So that's the background. Now, with this in mind, we now fast forward, as it were, to Sefer Maccabim. And Sefer Maccabim is written in the end of Bayit Sheni. Whether it's exactly at the time of the Chashmonayim or a generation or two afterwards, looking back, matter for scholars to debate. But we're talking about now the end of Bayit Sheni and the way that this action of Pinchas is looked at, namely with the story of Matityahu. Matityahu, of course, as we're familiar with from the Hanukkah story. So Matidyahu begins the rebellion by executing someone who was bringing a sacrifice, if I recall correctly, it was a pig, to one of the Greek gods. And the Sefer Maccabim reports, we don't have the original Hebrew, so I'm working with the English translation from the Greek. When Matidyahu saw this, he was fired with zeal, stirred to the depth of his being. He gave vent to his legitimate anger, threw himself on the man, and slaughtered him on the altar. So the Matidyahu takes action into his own hand. At the same time, he killed the king's commissioner who was there to enforce the sacrifice and tore down the altar. In his zeal for the law, right, the kin'ah, right, so that was presumably the term that was used originally, if the translation of the translation is accurate here. So the kano et kinati, so finds its expression in the zeal for the law. He acted as Pinchas had against Zimri, the son of Salu. So at least in the eyes of, maybe not of Matityahu, though probably in the eyes of Matityahu as well, but certainly in the eyes of the author of Sefer Maccabim. So what Matidyahu was doing was he was walking in the footsteps of his great granddaddy Pinchas, who also, as a Kohen, took matters into his own hand and killed people who were worshiping Avodah Zarah. Here, of course, there isn't any reference to any sexual activity, but why should we need it? Well, it's sufficient to be saying that if you have this pagan practice going on in your backyard, and you need to put a stop to it, and we'll say that there's no court to deal with it, because after all, the king's commissioner is right there, and so the courts are not operating. So someone has to take action into their own hands, and that's going to be Matityahu in this case. And of course, the fact that the rebellion is sparked by this incident, and then the result is the establishment of the reestablishment of the Mikdash, and for the first time since I guess maybe even since the Assyrian conquest, and certainly since the Babylonian conquest, for the first time you're going to have an independent Jewish commonwealth, which will last for about, well, depends on when you want to say that it ended, but it'll last for close to 200 years. So this is a sign of the fact, another breach shalom, as it were. And what Matidyahu then says, Matidyahu went through the town shouting at the top of his voice, "Let everyone who has any zeal for the law and takes a stand on the covenant come out and follow me." So this is a cry of Mi Lashem Elai. So this is very similar to I didn't mention this before, but if we're not going to get into it right now, but if the story of Baal Peor has parallels and antecedents in the story of the Egel, where Moshe himself had been the Kanai. Now there were no courts at that point. Moshe comes down from Sinai. He has the luchot. He breaks the luchot. He says Mila Shem Elai, and he calls, and it's Bnei Levi who join up. So here you again have a very similar type of situation. Also there, the Torah says Vayekumu Am Litzachek. So not only is there Avodah Zarah, there is also this. There it's less explicit, but it's Litzachek, right? That the people reveled. That is also indicative of sexual. We'll say at the very least sexual activity, but quite possibly sexual rights that are going on as well. So this is the the background, you can now draw a direct line from the Egel to Peor to 1,500 or so years later, maybe less than that, it's about 1,000 years later, to the story of the Maccabim. So there's a direct line that is being drawn, and absolutely no sense of any limitation, censure, or etc. This is exactly what Leviim and Kohanim are supposed to do. Perhaps by extension, all of us are supposed to do, given these kind of circumstances. So that's what where things would have stood, I suppose, had history not taken a different turn. And here, I just want to take a snippet from an article by Professor Yaakov Blitzstein, a short article. I recommend people take a look at it. It's a very interesting article. This is it's only about 4 pages long. Basically, what he points out in the article is that when you talk about Chanukah in Chazal, that the Hanukkah story that we were taught, going back to the time that I remember, the first time I remember hearing about the story of Matityahu, I must have been 7 or 8 years old, maybe even younger, I don't even know. But around that age, reading these kind of stories that were written for children, and but there is no mention of these stories in any source in Chazal, not in the Gemara, certainly not in the Mishnah, not in the Midrashim, etc. You don't have a discussion of the Mityavnim. You don't have a discussion of the Hellenizers, the Jewish Hellenizers. We do not know of Matityahu who kills a Jewish idolater, right? The incident that we just read doesn't appear in Chazal. It does not further tell of a civil war as the genesis of Hanukkah. This is this idea of the battle between the Maccabim and the Mityavnim does not exist. Al-Hanisim does tell the battle of the pure against the impure, the few against the many, the wicked against those who study Torah. But it's clear that it's a struggle of the Jewish people against the Gentile persecutor. Ironically, those who argue that Hanukkah delegitimizes any but authentic Jewish culture find their only source for that reading outside the Talmud in works which never entered the canon of Jewish learning. Right? So that's an aside, but that's very interesting. I know it's in authentic Jewish sources, we do not talk about the battle of Hanukkah as being the battle of Jewish culture or Jewish religion against foreign influences in the Jewish people. That's not mentioned in Chazal at all. So of course, the question then becomes, why repress memory of Jewish Hellenizers and of civil war as the matrix of Hanukkah? So Professor Blitzstein doesn't have an answer. I have no definitive answer or even suggestion, but then he finally does give one. Finally, the idea that a holiday could be the outcome of civil war between Jews, a proposition which encourages and legitimates intra-Jewish militancy, may simply have been unacceptable to Chazal. Indeed, the more immediate memory of the struggle against Rome, the struggle marked by the intramural Jewish antagonism and even bloodshed, taught a different lesson. Now, it's here, after all, if we, and I, as I said at the outset, I didn't have a chance to update the sheet for today's year, but given the fact that it's Shivasar B'Tammuz and the perhaps the most famous idea with regard to the background for Churban in Chazal is the Gemara in Yoma, perhaps the Gemara in Gittin, the idea that the second Beit HaMikdash was destroyed because of Sinat Chinam, however you want to define Sinat Chinam, and the factionalism and the intramural violence that occurred between different groups of Jews, and that's what led to the Churban. So the last thing that Tanaim and Amoraim, who are living within living memory for some of them of the events of the Churban. After all, keep in mind that the Churban takes place in the year 70, and the Mishnah is compiled in the year 200 approximately. So that within that just a little bit over a century, and you have Bar Kokhba in the middle. So you have the memory of what befell the Jewish people is so incredibly fresh that to take the Hanukkah story and to glorify the Civil War and to hold that as being a value, that becomes anathema. And so as a result, and again, we can't prove it, that this is the reason why it's deleted from the Chazal record, but it's a pretty good theory to throw out, that the view of zealotry in general and Civil War in particular takes on a very different cast when viewed not after the victory of the Chashmonaim, but after the destruction of Yerushalayim. So that's so that perhaps is going to influence how this idea of Kanaut plays out on the halachic level as well. So here you have, just to give another example of Kanaut during it's a critique but also a very sharp definition of what's going on at the time immediately before the Churban. The source number 4 here. Tanu Rabbanan, Maaseh b'shnei Kohanim. So this is a story of 2 Kohanim. Shahayu shnehem shavim v'ratzim v'olim b'kedash. So the 2 Kohanim, this is a Tosefta in Masechet Yoma, and here it's brought in the Gemara in Yoma. The Tosefta tells of 2 Kohanim who are racing up the ramp to the Mizbeach. Now, the background for this is that the first avodah of the day, the Trumat Hadeshen, the cleaning of the Mizbeach, of the remains of the previous day's korbanot, so originally was given to the first Kohen who made it up the ramp. People would, it's at the crack of dawn, it's even earlier, it's around 4 o'clock in the morning today, let's say, and you would have to, the Kohanim who would be there, so they would get the right to do the Trumat Hadesh. And the first Kohen who made it up, he would, up the ramp, he would be the one who would receive this honor. So there was a race, 2 Kohanim are going, who were running up. Kadam achad mehem letoch 400 shel chavero. So one of them got into the other's 2 meters, right? 4 amot are 2 meters. So there was a breach of social distancing on the race of the Mizbeach. It seems to me that the one Kohen pushed the other one out of the way so that he would get into the top first. Natal sakin b'takalo b'libo. So it created a rage incident where the other Kohen took out a knife and murdered the Kohen who had pushed him. Basically, he took out a knife, he plunged it into his heart. Amad Rabbi Tzadok al Ma'alot ha'ulam. So Rabbi Tzadok, who was a Kohen, and Rabbi Tzadok is also a person who is alive at the time of the Churban. He's mentioned in the story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and meeting Vespasian. So he asks for physicians to help heal Rabbi Tzadok, because Rabbi Tzadok had fasted for decades before the Churban in order to prevent the Churban. And who knows, maybe this incident is what started Rabbi Tzadok on his fast. Amad Rabbi Tzadok al Ma'olot ha'ulam. So he was standing on the steps of the Beit Hamikdash sanctuary. Amar Achenu Bnei Yisrael Shimu. So he calls out to everyone there. Harehu Omer ki matzei chalal ba'adama v'yatzus keinecha b'shovtecha. So the Torah tells us that if someone, if a body is found and we don't know who the perpetrator is, we measure between the neighboring towns and villages. Anu al mi lahavi agla arufa. Who should we bring an agla arufa for? Obviously, he's speaking metaphorically. We know who the murderer is. We know what the story is. It's a question of who's responsible. So al ha'ir o al azarot. Who's really responsible here? Is this something Rav Lichtenstein used this Gemara in the aftermath of the Rabin assassination to basically to say who's responsible? Is it society as a whole? Is it Ha'ir? Or is it the Azarot? Is it something which is internal here in the Mikdash? Right? Is it internal to our community? That's the question that Rabbi Tzadok wants to know. Ga'u kol ha'am b'bechiyah. So everyone who was present began to cry. It's reminiscent of the Hema Bochim, which we started the shir with, of Pinchas. They're crying out at the entrance to the Ohel Moed. And here too, the people are crying out at this expression of violence inside the Beit HaMikdash. Now, here comes the punchline though. Ba aviv shel tinok umatzuo keshehu mifarper. So the father of this young Kohen, who's the victim, the Kohen who was murdered, comes to his son's body and sees that his son is still alive. He's still twitching, mifarper. Amar, and this is the father of the victim's words. Harehu kaparatchem. This is your atonement. Adayin bini mifaper. My son is still twitching. He's still alive. Vilo nitma'a sakin. The knife, as a result, is not yet tameh. Only if the knife is in contact with a dead body would the knife become impure, ritually impure. This knife can still be used in the mikdash. It doesn't have to undergo any purification. And the Tosefta ends, L'lamdecha shekashe alehem tarat kelim yoter mishfichut damin. This teaches you how the society at the time, or the Kohanim at the time, are more concerned with the ritual purity, ritual impurity of the knife than they are with the fact that a murder just took place. Now, it's here the Braita is giving us really this expression of what is the price of Kanaut, the Vigilantism. Now, granted, of course, there was no Aveirah here. That, after all, there was no Avodah Zarah. There was no Gilui Arayot. There was, at the most, this would be akin to today to a case of road rage. Okay, that's what took place here. But still, the idea that what's important, what are our values? So the values, and this is obviously being the critique of Rabbi Tzadok himself and the critique of the narrator of the story, that this is where our society, or the Kohanim society, has reached. This is the depth that we've reached, that they care more about the ritual impurity than they care about murder. This is echoing what I think that the idea that Professor Blitzstein is saying. This is what, and this is, as I said, leads to the Churban. Or this is the generation of the Churban, And this is what's going on in the Beit HaMikdash. Now, that, as I said, is sort of as a background. Now let's take a look at some of the examples where halachically we talk about kana'im pogim bo, where we talk about this idea that a zealot, a vigilante, can take the law into their own hands. And the Mishnah in Sanhedrin says the following: Hagonev et hakasva, hamikalel bekosem, haboel aramit. So somebody who steals a vessel from the Beit HaMikdash, that's what a kasva is. Hamikalel bekosem, somebody who curses God's name, curses God with a incantation of some kind. Haboel aramit, someone who has relations with a non-Jewish woman. Kana'im pogim bo. Now the Mishnah ends with the following, a fourth case. Kohen sheshimesh b'tum'ah, right? The same tum'ah that we were just talking about in the previous the previous case. Kohen sheshimesh tum'ah ein echav hakohanim mevi'in oto lebeitin. So the fellow kohanim don't need to bring him to a beitin, ela pirchei kuna motziin oto chutz la'azara umafziin et mocho b'gezirin. So the punishment for presumably not knowingly serving in the Beit HaMikdash when one is impure is that the other Kohanim are supposed to clean up the Mikdash. How do they do that? By taking him out of the Mikdash and executing him on the spot. And the way that the execution is going on is a particularly grisly type of execution. Right? Mafziin et mocho b'gzirin. So they basically they split his head asunder. That's this is the three or perhaps four cases where we talk about the idea of kana'im pogim bo. Now, one has to ask, what do these why these specific averot? They don't necessarily have to be. They're not the most severe crimes on the books. There isn't even a mention of avodah zarah here as being a reason for vigilantism. The case of Matityahu does not fall into the Mishnah. I mean, not only the historical case doesn't fall in, but the idea that this is a crime that you would talk about kana'im pogim bo doesn't appear here. What do they all have in common? So it would seem that what they have in common is that there is a violation of the of a larger sanctity that is being and a divine sanctity. If you're talking about the cases that are on the brackets, you have the gonevet hakasva. You have somebody who steals a vessel from the Beit HaMikdash, misappropriation of property that belongs to the Beit HaMikdash and used in chulin. So that's a violation of the sanctity of the Mikdash. And of course, on the other side, you have the Kohen who is serving with this in the state of impurity, also violating the sanctity of the Mikdash. In the middle, you have the case of Mekalel Kosem. So you have a person who is directly attacking God by not only mentioning his name. This isn't a case of blasphemy in that sense, but it's blasphemy that he's actually cursing God. So this is something for that's going to fall into the category of kana'im pogim bo. And then you have the case of Boel Aramit. Now, Boel Aramit isn't so clear. Why should this be the case? And the Gemara says that the idea is that it is the idea that and the Gemara asks, "Bagda Yehuda b'toiva nasta b'Yisrael v'Yerushalayim." This is the Gemara explaining the different cases that Yehuda um, was boged, so had betrayed God, and a toeva has been done in Yisrael. What is the toeva? What is this abomination? Ki chilal Yehuda kodesh Hashem asher ahav, that Yehuda has blasphemed the kodesh that he had loved, u'ba'al bat el necha, and had literally had relations with the daughter of a foreign god. So the drasha on this idea is Bagda Yehuda zo avodah zara, u'ba'al bat el nechar ze habal ad hanochri. So the betrayal is avodah zara. The expression of it is to have relations with a non-Jewish woman. The idea being, well, on a pshat level, you would say, well, of course, these are two things that are going to be going hand in hand along the lines of the story of Pinchas. Again, that you have this intertwining of avodah zarah, of pagan worship, alongside with ritual sexual activity. I'll just say as an aside that this is quite possibly, though we don't know with 100% surety, but it certainly is a strong possibility, that the reason why we do not have priestesses, right? We don't have this idea of kohanot, but benot kohanim, having a role in the mikdash. So for another shiur, right? It's a very interesting discussion. What is the sanctity of a daughter of a kohen, or we'll say a kohenet? Okay, is there such a concept? Does she have inherent kedusha, or is the kedusha only passed on to the males? Spoiler alert, I think that there's inherent kedusha in the females as well. However, that's not, but what's totally clear is that there is no role whatsoever for kohanot in the mikdash itself. All of the activities of the in the mikdash are explicitly b'nei Aharon hakohanim, not the daughters, and for good reason. It's quite possible that the Torah wants to make sure that there is no intermingling of the of our avodah, not avodah zarah, of our avodah with any ritual sexual activity. And the way to do that is to make sure that the priestesses aren't on the campus. They're not there. There are no such things as kohanot. So, but this combination is quite possible as to why when looking at the pasuk in Malachi. So that's the idea here. However, Chazal took it one step further and said, no, it's Boel Aramit, it's Boel Nachrit. Why? Amar Vichia Baravuya, Kol Habal Nachrit Kilu Mitchaten Bavodah Zarah. The whoever has it is as though they are marrying Avodah Zarah. This is expressed. We'll skip a few. We'll come back to the hopefully to those sources I'm about to skip. What's going on here? So the Rambam makes the following observation. The Rambam says that this is source. Just 1 second. Apologize. Source number 12 here. The Rambam says that the lo pagu bo kanaim, the lo hilko beitin, hare em shom mefurash b'divrei kabbalah shehu b'karet. So, speaking of, in general, a person who has relations with a non-Jewish woman, so then the punishment is correct. And he quotes the pasuk which we just said. הנה למטה שהבוא אל כותית כאילו נתחתן לעקום, שנאמר הוא בעל לנכר ונקרא מחלל קודש השם. This is it's a defilement of the sanctity of God. Now, the Rambam realizes that this is not it's b'divrei Kabbalah shehu b'karet. There is no isser. If you take a look at the list at the end of Parshat Achrei Mot, Parshat Kedoshim, where we have a list of all of the arayot, of all of the sexual relations which are banned and have karet. So a non-Jewish woman doesn't make the list. It's only b'divrei Kabbalah. Divrei Kabbalah for the Rambam means in the words of the Nevi'im. Right? It's based on this idea of that we just read in the Pasuk in Malachi. It's not explicit. So, however, the Rambam says, what is the real problem here? Nikra mechalel kodesh Hashem. Here we have a person who is violating the sanctity of God. Avon zeh, af al pi she'en bo mitat beit din, al yeh kal beinecha, al yeh bo hefsed. יש בו הפסד שאין בכל העריות כמותו, שהבן מן הערווה בנו הוא לכל דבר, ובכלל ישראל נחשב, אף על פי שהוא ממזר. So the Rambam is cognizant that it's not on the list, is cognizant that I'm going to point this out and say, well, why are we so fired up about this idea, about this particular Aveirah, of this intersexual activity between Jew and non-Jew? Why is that so important? And the answer is because even though it doesn't have a capital punishment, and it's and other averot of Gilui Arayot do, nevertheless, al yeh kal beinecha. Don't let this make it any less severe in your eyes, because there is a tremendous loss. Yesh bo hefsed. Right? You have a tremendous loss to the Jewish people. The issue of this relationship, the child that comes from this relationship, so any other incestuous relationship or any other adulterous relationship. So the child is a mamzer or mamzeret, but has full rights as a Jew, has full relationship with the parents. And now is not the time to get into what a mamzer is, but basically all of the responsibilities that a parent has for their child applies equally to a child who is designated as a mamzer, is an illegitimate child. But that doesn't apply to the child born from a non-Jewish woman. Haben min hakutit. However, the son from a non-Jew, eino bno, is not halachically considered, legally considered to be a child of the father. So it's basically, as we know, this is a problem which is comes down to this very day in massive proportion, that a child of a mixed marriage is not considered to be a Jew, and if the mother isn't Jewish. So that, the Rambam says, is what is so terrible about this idea. So basically you have a sense, all of the examples that we spoke about in the Mishnah, that the issue here is primarily not one of the severity of the crime, but one of the consequences that come out of the crime. That you have a undermining and a violation of the kedusha, whether it's the kedusha of the mikdash or it's the kedusha of the person himself or herself in terms of the Kedushat Yisrael. That is the crimes that allow for a Kana'i response. No other Aveira can, as severe as it may be. Now, this finds voice in the Amoraim describing what Pinchas saw in the previous source here, number 11. So it's Vayar Pinchas ben Elazar. So what you have then is Amarav Ra'am Ma'asev v'Niskar Halacha. So Rav said, what did he see? He saw the act and he remembered the halacha. Rav seems to be focusing on the activity itself. But Shmuel says, Shmuel Amar, Ra'ah she'ein chokhmah ve'ein tfuna ve'ein eitzah leneged Hashem. So Shmuel says that, what did he see? He saw a hopeless situation. Kol makom sheyesh chilul Hashem, ein cholkin kavod l'Rav. Wherever you have a situation where you have chilul Hashem, so you don't wait for Moshe Rabbeinu in this case to give a psak halacha. You act accordingly. Chilul Hashem has to be dealt with immediately. This is an expression of what Rabbi Yitzchak Amar Belezer says, Ra'ah sheba malach v'hishchit ba'am. That what Pinchas saw wasn't even the action of the Chilul Hashem in of itself, but the fact that the Chilul Hashem had immediate consequences, that there was now a plague going on with 24,000 people dead. That's what Pinchas felt needs to be addressed. Now, these last two ideas, and maybe Rav agrees to it to a certain extent as well, but certainly these last two ideas is limiting the Kana'ut. Because here we have a situation where zealotry is being, in terms of the legislation, as it were, is being limited to the very specific cases. I'll just point out a very, an irony, which, when we talk about the halachot of Kana'ut, there's an irony involved. The very fact that we are limiting the Kanai, that doesn't make much sense at all, right? We're dealing with something which by its very essence is extra legal, okay? Maybe not anti, but certainly extra legal. And we're saying, well, we're going to tell you, we're going to legislate when you can break the system. Right? That very notion that we're going to legislate and limit the application of vigilantism, right? So that is pretty remarkable when you think about it. Because after all, by definition, a vigilante is somebody who's not working within the system. Let's see some other limitations that come up. Okay, we don't have time for that right now. We'll take a look at who is who's allowed to be a vigilante. So there's an interesting tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein, written to one of his sons-in-law, not to Rabbi Tendler, to another one of his sons-in-law, where he, so he was asked, this was in the 1950s, it was a short, almost an essay, it was a letter written to him, but it was an essay which he writes about the Kana'im Pogim, this whole concept of the zealot and his actions. And he says the following: Hinei vadai ha'emet, kasher katafta b'shem ha'gaon of Shlomo Hyman Zatzal, shelo hutar zeh ela lekana'in, shehu kedeperush Rashi b'Sanhedrin daf pei aleph, b'nei adam kisherim hamit kanim kinato shel makom hogin bo ayin sham. Was by definition, you have the person who is the Kana'i has to be a person who's kasher. Rashi threw that in, and Rav Moshe is building on that one word that Rashi said, because Rashi didn't say b'nei adam hamit kanim, people who have this zealotry, but rather b'nei adam ksherim hamit kanim, people who are kasher who have this. V'imu l'chavana acheret. Now this line is just, every time I read it, it really just almost blows me away. Imu l'chavana acheret. So if I'm doing it for ulterior motivations, eino kanai, hare eino kanai, v'lo hu tarla. Okay, so it means if I have ulterior motivations, so I'm not allowed to pick up my spear. That okay, I'm willing, okay, I'm able to hear that. But then umamela hu rotzeach mamash. Now that's very interesting. In other words, there are two people who are, let's recreate the story of Pinchas. And there are two people who see Zimri ben Salu and Kazbi Batsur in the act. One's name is Pinchas. The other's name is Yehuda Sussman. Right? I'm put there. Pinchas is the kasher person. I'm not the kasher. I have an axe to grind, or a spear to chuck, as it were, against Zimri ben Salu. And I am a little bit faster on the trigger than Pinchas is. We both lift up our spears, we both throw it, but my spear hits first. So then, according to Rav Moshe, I am a rotseach, I'm a murderer. Shehu chayav mita, and it's a capital offense. Kafi she'yadua klapei Shemaya. Now, of course, Moshe is not going to be able to know that. No one's going to know my motivations. I can hide behind the claim that I'm doing this as in the service of God, but God knows. Right? Now that could explain why God has to give Pinchas his Briti Shalom, because if Pinchas was doing this for any motivation other than the purest of motivations, so then even though the act is an appropriate act, but if the person who's following through on the act is not appropriate, so then the act becomes murder. Right? So this is something which is really something to twist your mind, at least that I find I'm twisting my mind about it even as I talk about it, that the same act under the same circumstances will be or not be considered murder based on the motivation of the person who is implementing it. We wouldn't say that about anything else. We wouldn't say, for example, if a person were, let's say, the executioner in the Beit HaMikdash, in the Beit Din, excuse me. Right? That's his job. He's the executioner. And he now takes a person out for skila, sreifa, hereg, whatever it may be, and his motivations aren't pure. We would never say that he's a murderer. He's acting appropriately in the circumstances. We might say that he should read some Mesilat Yesharim before he does it. I don't know, right? He should be working on his motivations, but he's certainly not a Rotseach. He's an officer of the court. What Rav Moshe is saying here is that he's not an officer of the court. The act of kana'ut has to be done appropriately, otherwise it is it's murder. So not only is there a limitation in terms of the cases that it can be applied, but there's a limitation as to who can be the executioner. Okay. Now the Rav Kook takes this one step further. Of course, Rav Kook wrote this before Rav Moshe did. This is written about 40 or so years before Rav Moshe's tshuva that we just read. Rav Kook, in his commentary to the Siddur, the Olat Raya, so he says the following. This is we read the psukim of beginning of Parshat Pinchas at a Brit Milah, the Briti Shalom that's mentioned, the Kanoat Kinati. So when he talks about on that pasuk of Kanoat Kinati, Rav Kook takes the opportunity to speak about Pinchas, and he says the following: HaKadosh Baruch Hu yachso v'hodir l'kol shetiv'o shel Pinchas hu kiteva zikno Aharon HaKohen. What's the idea that God said at the beginning of our parsha, Hineni noten lo briti shalom, and calls him Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aharon HaKohen, to tell us that Pinchas is Aharon. Pinchas, who is at least prima facie the anti-Aharon. Aharon is, as he continues, Hatov v'ahahuv l'kol. Aharon was the good, the beloved to all, Rodef HaShalom, who strove for peace, right? The man of peace. The last thing that Aharon is a Kana'ai. He's the last idea that we would consider him to be a zealot. Was the idea of Moshe, so just said that a person has to be kasher, right? Ksherim. Change the color here to make it match. But but Rav Kook says that it's not enough to be an Adam kasher. You have to be a person who is Aharon. You have to be a person who's the anti-Kanai. Only an anti-Kanai can be a Kanai. Anyone who is not the anti-Kanai, so they're not entitled to the to this. Now he gives this. This is based on a shiur that he gave, and it's not his own writings, but he in a shiur of Kook basically says the same idea as Rav Moshe at this point. V'chein kula rak b'matar levarer Torah l'shem shamayim. Rak b'tnai ba'el nehafach ha'maaseh ha'asur ha'mitameh l'maaseh mutar l'maaseh kadosh. But it's only under these circumstances that this terrible act, the execution, as I said, the case that I gave you before, of a executioner in Sanhedrin, that's not an act which is not an act which is an act of isur. It's not an act which is mitameh. That is a legitimate requirement of the court system. There is capital punishment in Judaism, and we're very, very careful about the meting out of that punishment. And we have all of the guidelines in terms of edut and due process, etc., which are there that to really protect the innocent, to make sure, to the best of our ability, that no innocent person is executed for a crime that he or she did not commit. But once the sentence is handed out, so then it's not murder anymore. This is murder. This is B'kanoet Kinati is murder. And only, Rav Kook is saying, only along the lines of Rav Moshe, only if it's being done in the most proper way, and the only way that we can assure that it's being done in the proper way is if the person himself is not a person who has any violent tendencies at all. So then we can talk about how they took this action into their own hands because there was no other way of dealing with it, and then the kana'ut becomes a legitimate kana'ut. But this is, to think about it, if Rav Moshe, if Rav Kook were to be given were to be able to go to Matityahu and express this shita to him, I wouldn't be surprised if they would be, victims of Matityahu's Kanaut as well. This is so clearly not the approach which is being taken by, at least by the author of Sefer Maccabim, in terms of understanding Matityahu's action. To be saying that this is, that the Kanaut itself is so problematic. It's only under very specific circumstances and only very specific people. So this is clearly something which is not along the lines of the way it was, of the way that it has been understood earlier. To finish up today, a few more minutes. So, I'd like to, we don't have time for all the Makorot. Is to talk about the following issue, namely, if we are just to close with the question is this a, once we've said that it becomes a once it becomes limited to very specific cases. So now I have the case of sexual relations between Jew and non-Jew. So is it under all circumstances that we would be viewing this as not only a case for Kana and Pogenbo, but for the Aveira itself to be considered on this level? What needs to be done? So here, let me try to explain through the Makorot itself, is what I'm trying to get at. The Rambam says the following, source number 15. Lo asrat Torah ela derech chatnut. Aval habal akutit derech znut makinoto makat mardut midivrei sofrim gzeira shema yavo lehitchaten. So the Rambam, in discussing the isur of a relationship between Jew and non-Jew, says that the actual isur on the book for the Torah is only if there's an intermarriage. But if habal akutit derech znut, if the sexual activity was done not within the context of marriage, but was done promiscuously, then the punishment is lashes for rebelling against Chazal, because it's the Gezeirah, there's no Isur D'Oraita to have sex with a non-Jew. The Isur D'Oraita is to marry a non-Jew. But then, of course, the Rambam has to deal with the case of Pinchas. So what does he do with that? Kol haboel kutit ben derech chatnut ben derech snut. So whether it is, if you have this sexual relation with the non-Jewish woman, whether it's derech chatnut, is whether or not it was done in marriage or done promiscuously, im ba'ala b'farhesia, if it was done publicly, v'hu sheyiv'ol le'enei asara miYisrael o yoter, im pagu bo kana'im v'hargo arei elu mishubachim b'zrizin, v'davar ze halacha Moshe Sinai, raya l'davar ze maseh Pinchas b'zimri. So the Rambam, based on the Gemara, it's not the Rambam making this up, but that the only time that you have the death penalty that's attached, what we spoke about before, is when we're dealing with a situation where the act was done b'farhesia, was done publicly. And how do I define public? Hu sheyiv'ol le'enei asara miYisrael o yoter. So you need a tzibur, you need at least a minyan of witnesses that see this, and then the kanai can be pogeh. This is, again, this is all within this the context that it's not the aveira per se, but it's because if it was the aveira per se, what should it matter whether it's being done privately or it's being done publicly? What should it matter if the whether it should matter. So not what should matter. It should matter whether it's a isur deoraita or it's not an isur deoraita. Here, it's not the avera per se; it's the violation of the sanctity that is being that's being used. And here you have other examples that come up. The Rambam in the last line of the next halacha, halacha hey, Rambam says, "Abba albat ger toshav ena kanaim pogid bo, aval makino to makat mardut." So if you have a person who presumably in public, the girl in question is non-Jewish. She's a bat ger toshav. Okay, she is non-Jewish, but she herself is not a idolatress. She's not a pagan. She's accepted upon herself the Shivat Mitzvot B'nai Noach. She's living as a ger toshav, a legitimate resident in society. That's so that's the bat. Now, of course, if there will be children from this relationship, so the children will not be Jewish, but still, ein hakadaim pogimbo. So we don't have kanaim that will have the pigiyah. Kanaim cannot get involved here. Presumably, the Rambam doesn't explain why. This is a chiddush of the Rambam, but the presumably because you don't have that element of chilul Hashem. You don't have the element of the violation of the sanctity of Klal Yisrael, even though the issue might of the relationship might not be Jewish, but the this idea that it's a direct affront to the Kedushat Yisrael, that isn't going on here, and therefore it wouldn't carry the same kind of penalty, and Kanaim Pogin would not be allowed. The Ran, I'll just close with this Ran, because the Ran says the following. The Ran says he just makes the following observation. Afagav, the Yisrael habala kutit ika karet. So even though the halacha is that a Jew who has relations with a non-Jewish woman, the penalty, as we saw in the Rambam, could be karet, kida'achre rav legamre, okay, and he brings various sources. Mikol makom, here, what about the opposite? Kuti haba al bat Yisrael. What if we're not dealing with a Jewish man and a non-Jewish woman, but we're dealing with a non-Jewish man and a Jewish woman? So in terms of the Aveira, presumably, it should be the same. But he says, no, lo shamanu sheyeh bakaret. There is no indication, right? This is an exception to the rule. It doesn't matter, whether, generally speaking, if we generally look at the Gilui Arayot as being equal opportunity. It's the penalty and the nature of the Aveira is the same for both people who are involved in this illicit relationship. But here we say no. If it's a non-Jewish woman and a Jewish man, so then it becomes karet. Then we have the whole idea of kanai poginbo, etc. But if it's reversed and it's a Jewish woman with a non-Jewish man, so then that doesn't hold. That's no longer the case. Why? The Ran says vidinhu, and this makes perfect sense. Namely, dinhu. The Yisrael aniv'elet lekuti b'nai mashech acharei v'yeh Yisrael. Yisrael haba lekutit havlad nimshach acharecha. Okay, so the difference is whether or not the child. In other words, this goes again back to the issue of the kedusha. the kedusha of the child is not in danger if the father is non-Jewish. And because of that, the nature of the relationship is viewed in a different lens than in the situation where it's a Jewish man and a non-Jewish woman. When it's a Jewish man and a non-Jewish woman, since the child will not be Jewish, so then the nature of the Aveira is one of a violation of Kedusha, and there that changes everything. It becomes an Aveira where you could have karet attached to it, and it also becomes a situation where, as we said at the outset, where you can have Tanaim Pogim. So to sum up, as always, there's still Makorot left on the sheet for another time, but the idea that what we have here is that you see a relationship where the notion of Kanaim is being very limited to specific situations, at least according to the Halacha and Chazal, very specific situations where the kedusha of Am Yisrael as a whole is at risk, or the kedusha of Am Yisrael, or the kedusha of the Mikdash is at risk, and not in situations where even if the Aveira is a very severe Aveira, if it was Shabbat, Avodah Zarah, etc., we wouldn't say it. So therefore, if you were to put it into a modern context, right? So then presumably Halacha would frown on anyone throwing a stone against a car driving by on Shabbat. That is not an example of Kanaim Pogim. That would go against the Halacha. And presumably, this is for another discussion, though someone sent me out privately on the chat, the question, presumably political zealotry as well would not be sanctioned halachically. Okay, so that's for the shir. Have a continued Tzom Kal and a Shabbat Shalom. Kol tov.